I want you to think about as we go through this, how you can use the things that I'm going to talk about in business storytelling. Okay? The same concepts that are used to tell these stories that we remember from when we were little kids can be used in stories that you tell for business. Okay? Les Brown said this, and it reminds me of one of the very first elements of storytelling, which is why. If you understand and communicate your why, and you can communicate it in a way that engages people, I'm going to go through the different elements of storytelling, but I can tell you, if you have that why down, all the rest of it will fall into place. Okay? That why makes people invest themselves in your story. Anybody here a Breaking Bad fan? Okay, Walter White is a meth producer and dealer, right? And yet, somehow, the people that crafted that story get us to care about Walter White. So think about projects that you might have, where you might have a presentation that may not all be wonderful positives. There may be some negatives. Maybe there's a big investment involved in some capital project, right? But if you sell the why behind it, you can get people to like that project even if it's got some warts like a meth dealer, right? Any Dexter fans in here? He's a serial killer. But he's the hero of this show, right? That people have binge watched, right? Pardon me? He only kills bad people. So, see? And does that make you like him? It's a redeeming quality, right? If you have a project and you're presenting it to people who are just looking at the dollars and the cents and possibly the negatives of it, if you can find that little thing that makes them think, but gosh, it'll make our processes so much better, it'll make us so much more efficient, right? If they fall in love with that, that carries you a long way. It cures a lot of ills, right? So what's your one thing, your why, right? You're going to hear me talk about you already have, about a lot of movies, TV shows, because they're stories that are told really well, and they're lessons that we can learn that we can implement in business. So the why is what I'm talking about, and I think about that City Slickers where he told them one thing, right? You need to figure out whatever it is in your story that you're trying to communicate, the one thing should be your why, not your what. The what may be our $10 million capital project for this great new software implementation. That's the what. But what's the why? Is it going to help us achieve our corporate vision, our mission? You have to figure out that why before you even talk about any of the other stuff that I'm about to jump into. But I want to give you some nuts and bolts so that when you walk out of here, you can say, okay, I didn't just get entertained for a few minutes. I got some stuff that I can actually implement and use in my work. So why use stories? I think I've shared a few examples of why, but there's science behind it, right? I'm kind of old, so to me, that graphic means something. Anybody relate to that one? Anyone? Okay. Okay, so stories are memorable. They're not just memorable for no particular reason, but 5% of people, if you just give them an individual statistic, this project cost X, surveys say that type of information, only about 5% of people are going to remember that, but when you put it in a story, they're 22 times more likely to remember that fact. It gives them context, right? If I say Bueller, people start getting all these images of the movie and their favorite scene and Ferris and all of the characters, right? So all this stuff starts rushing back into your mind because you have associations with that, right? Those associations don't happen on accident. So our brain has different chemicals that fire off when we listen to stories. And these different chemicals have different reactions. Some of them help us focus. Some of them make us feel good, right? And so when we hear stories and these chemical reactions go on, what happens over time, this is your brain on stories, right? So over time, let's say you have to make a decision, and this decision then leads to some action, right? So you have all those chemicals that I was talking about firing off in your brain, okay? That triggers physiological reactions in our body, okay? So for example, you might your heart might beat more rapidly or slower, depending on what's going on. Your breathing might get shallow. When people are like sad, their breathing gets more shallow. Sometimes when people are upset, their breathing gets shallow. It affects your physiology, right? Or it may get more rapid. When people are excited, they start breathing faster. Okay, so what happens over time is all this stuff is going on, all these physiological reactions, and you just made a decision, let's say buying a car, for example, okay? So let's say you buy a car, you get in your new car, you start driving it around, and you feel great, right? So cortisol and oxytocin and dopamine are firing off, and you're getting all these physical reactions. Over time, you're making decisions, you're getting these changes in your physiology. And it's repetition, repetition, repetition. Now, down the road, you go to buy a car, and before you've bought that car, that salesperson says and does things that trigger those chemicals, and because of the associations you have, you go, when I made a decision before like this, I felt really good. And the science kicks in, and you just start feeling good before you've even made the decision, right? Then you make the decision, and in some cases, maybe you get buyer's remorse, but that's kind of how that works, right? So you have all these associations. Now, what I find when I speak to crowds, so I'm an FP&A guy. I've been in FP&A for 20 years, right? And the first reaction I got when I proposed a session on storytelling was, I don't know, storytelling sounds kind of touchy-feely. You know, most of our folks, they're numbers people. They work with budgets and finance and things like that. We need something more concrete. We're people first, right? So I hear people say, well, my CFO is very, very numbers-driven. Well, that's great, but they're people too. So it doesn't matter if they're an IT person, your CFO, a finance person, numbers-oriented, it doesn't matter. Is everyone familiar with, not the platinum rule, I'll talk about that in a second. Is everyone familiar with the golden rule? Show of hands? Okay, you guys are awake, great. Okay, so golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right, okay. So the platinum rule says, forget that. Because I may not want done unto me as you want done unto you. I'll give you an example. I have an accounting degree. I'm very numbers oriented. I'm very detail oriented. So if someone asks me a question to someone who's not a finance or accounting person, they might perceive me as throwing up information on them. I just naturally give a lot of information because I like a lot of information. Everyone is not the same, right? So I want you to get rid of the golden rule and give people what they want, not what you want. So how does that apply to stories? Well, if I told you a story like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, that may not resonate with you where you are now, right? We're all adults in this room. But if I told you a story that was more sort of in your wheelhouse, based on what I know about you, it's going to resonate more with you, right? You'll get more engaged with that story. So what makes a story? Let's talk about some nuts and bolts. Whoops. So I'm going to go through each one of these in turn. So let's talk about the first one. Imagine if Martin Luther King Jr. had given the I have a plan speech. I have a great plan. Here it is, step 1, step 2, step 3. It's a great plan. Okay, you might get some people on board with that. But he talked about his why before he ever talked about what or how. And I think in my 20-plus years of experience in FP&A, what I've seen a lot of is the what and the how, either before the why or sometimes even without a why at all. Some companies never communicate their why, right? So what is your why for whatever it is you're communicating? Because I'm talking about storytelling in the context of business, where maybe you're presenting a report, a project, whatever the case may be. Okay. Thank you.